For now, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Marcus Ranum. And I first met Marcus at an IONS event, which, if you guys haven't gone, they're going to be here on December 1st and 2nd in LA. And they put on these tremendous events with faculty who are just enormously skilled. And so Marcus is CSO for Tenable Security, and most of you are familiar with the NSA scanner and you know, just one of our luminaries here in information security. And I'm like, I am not going to read your bio because that's just going to put everyone to sleep. So I said, give me a quote, give me something that you want to tell the audience. And so I'll take out all the swear words. But it basically went like this. How come the nonprofits don't have enough money to secure themselves when people aren't giving them enough money, but we have, what did you say that the Department of Defense could buy? They can buy an F-35 Raptor for more money than the economy of, I believe, Bolivia. So I want to tell you that the steering committee asked Marcus to talk about something controversial, to get us riled up, to give us another perspective. And so are you ready with the mic? Oh, we're going to need to switch the slides. Oh, this is like the best title. You don't need to hide if you're not doing anything wrong. So anyway, it is if we can switch the slides, please. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome Marcus Ranum to the stage. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Good. I feel like I'm kind of stuck up here as the sacrificial lamb, and I hope I don't drive too many of you nuts. There's a concept in political marketing called the Overton Window, and listening to the previous panel, all I could think of was the Overton Window is going back and forth violently like a sheet in a hurricane. The idea of the Overton Window is it's essentially the spectrum of appropriate dialogue. And so if you have a view that is politically far to the right, what you do is you come in and you say, you know, instead of doing some bulk surveillance, we're going to insert location detecting butt plugs in everybody. Everybody goes, whoa, that's a horrible idea. And then suddenly, okay, now we can talk about surveillance. It sounds much more reasonable, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to maunder about a bunch of different stuff. This turned out to be one of the hardest presentations I've ever written. Usually when I'm talking about something, I'm able to stick to dry technical facts of computer security. And I can't do that with this particular topic because privacy is not a technical problem. As we saw, privacy is not a problem that we can really reason about particularly well. It's a political problem, right? It's a problem about how people are going to work together or how people are going to interact together. And all of that is governed by politics. And unfortunately, as math is the language of physics, philosophy is the language of politics, or history is the language of politics, if you want to look at the failures of politics going through. So I originally thought of approaching this talk as a historical talk, and I started digging up as much as I could about the history of attitudes towards privacy through time. That would actually make a really interesting talk that I might do some other day, but I can't do both. So I'm going to focus on a couple of things. I'm going to throw out a few strange extrapolations from the idea of democracy, and some of these are going to be ridiculous. My job here is to stretch that Overton window for you. So one of the things I should say as part of this continuing set of disclaimers is that many of the things that I'm going to propose are not things I necessarily believe. However, like most of the people on the panel ahead of me, the things that I believe are not necessarily any more realistic than the things that are actually happening. So I'm going to just kind of throw some ideas out and we'll see what happens. Okay, so here's an axiom I'm not going to go into too much more detail about, but for all intents and purposes, privacy and secrecy are the same thing. If I can keep a secret, I can keep things private. The other thing is that the idea of privacy and secrecy is inherent in the idea of my information, right? If I have a piece of information, by definition, I have privacy and secrecy rights over that piece of information. Otherwise, it's not my piece of information. It's a piece of public information. If I have a piece of information that is not written on the bathroom wall at the local pub, or actually more precisely, written at the bathroom wall of every pub and splashed all over, bulletin boards or whatever, it is my piece of information and I have the privacy rights over it. So one of the things that we seem to keep forgetting is this idea that somebody can have a piece of private information, temporarily entrust it to another person, and no longer have an expectation of privacy. What the fuck? It's my information. I gave it to someone, just the fact that I used the word entrust should tell you that I have extended trust to that person. I do have an expectation of privacy. What has happened with Google and all of the Google email questions that we were hearing on the panel is that our idea of desiring a system that not only worked but gave us privacy has been betrayed, and so we're willing to settle for a system that works. So think about that as we go forward, right? So the argument that I've heard persistently over and over again when people are trying to attack the idea of individual privacy is, if you've got nothing worth hiding, then if you haven't done anything wrong, you've got nothing to hide. And therefore, the fact that your privacy is going away is not a big deal. You actually haven't lost anything. That's actually a very legitimate philosophical argument, right? I can't take something from you if it's not worth anything. You can't defend it if it's not worth anything. You can't miss it if it's not worth anything. So when the anti-privacy advocates, or whatever position you particularly want to put them on the spectrum, are saying that if you're not doing anything wrong, you have nothing to hide, what they're really saying is your privacy is worthless. Get over it. Okay, that's a thought. I'm going to roll with that concept. We're going to go forward with that concept, and we're going to see what some of the conclusions from that rather bizarre position are. Okay, so one of the things that I think is a better way of characterizing that argument that we've heard, and we heard several times on the preceding panel. I'm not here to rebut the preceding panel. They're all much smarter and more articulate than I am. But the idea of what is being said is, in order to allow government to do what government is supposed to do, which is ostensibly to protect people from other governments, citizens have to give up some of their privacy, right? The debate that we were just hearing was the question of to what degree people have to give up their privacy to protect them from their own government, right? Because implicit in that is, if I'm protecting you from governments, I'm protecting you from all governments. That includes my government. So one of the questions is, who are we more afraid of? Are we more afraid of Saddam Hussein, who, by the way, is a long way from here, well, now that he's dead. But are we more afraid of the people in Yemen, or are we more afraid of the people in Texas? I can answer that without thinking for half a second. I'm much more afraid of the people in Washington than I am afraid of the people in Texas, and I'm much more afraid of the people in Washington than I am of the people in Yemen, because who has the ability to do me wrong is really the question that any philosopher would ask about who should I fear, right? Anyway, the idea is that this is all done in accordance with the rule of law. Government has to justify its actions based on some kind of argument, and that argument is going to have to involve evidence or probable cause. Probable cause is, I think you're about to do something bad. Evidence is, I have evidence that shows that you've done something bad. So in that situation, there's no need to do a fishing expedition at all, right? We've already determined that this guy's a bad actor. He's given up some of his arguable civil rights, and we're now going to say, the fact that you have a habit of making meth means that we do reserve the right to come and check up on your meth-making activities periodically, and we're going to kind of restrict your ability to buy certain weird chemicals. But so here's the first problem. Let's be honest. I really want to be honest about this stuff. And we have to be honest to ourselves that the U.S. government has conspired consistently to bypass its own protections. This is where the Overton Window concept comes in. The government has this fairly clearly written Fourth Amendment and has been interpreting the law. And we heard several times in the panel before that this notion that the law has to be interpreted. Really? Listen, if the law has to be interpreted, it's a really badly written law. Maybe the law needs to be rewritten, and that's a public process that should be undertaken publicly, right? The Fourth Amendment should say your data has no privacy. Obviously, it was written before there was data. So what we do is we try to extrapolate forward. But when we talk about search and seizure of an individual's goods, what about that doesn't apply to data? Well, what about that doesn't apply to data is it is incredibly inconvenient for law enforcement and the government to have it apply to data. That's really what we're saying. So as we talk about interpretations of law, and we talk about the Bill of Rights, and we talk about the Constitution, we're talking about a document that has been being stretched and stretched and stretched in its interpretation for the convenience of the state that ostensibly offered us that document. So that's something to think about. If you don't believe me, go look up about the UK-USA Treaty Group and the data sharing that takes place for there. So in order to bypass the Fourth Amendment, the US government conspired with the English government, the Canadian government, and the Australian government that you spy on our people, we'll spy on your people, and we'll ask you for what you're getting about our people, and we'll share with you what we're getting about your people. Right? We're not spying on Americans, we're spying on Australians. We're sharing data with the Australians, and that just happens to be a coincidence, right? But the point is, if we were talking in a criminal court here, I would say there's evidence of conspiracy. And there's some interesting things that happen when you talk about evidence of conspiracy, right? If I'm going to say someone's conspiring to bypass the law, it means they understood the fucking law in order to try to bypass it. So when these people in Washington are saying that this is an issue, what they're saying is, you caught us lying, so we're going to double down with more lies, okay? Now, let me continue. The increasingly fine parsing of what constitutes... Thank you. At least not everyone thinks I'm crazy. You're going to probably be throwing bottles at me in a few minutes when I really get onto the point that I'm going to try to make. The increasingly fine parsing of what constitutes surveillance is another example of how the Fourth Amendment has been stretched completely out of shape, right? The idea that people can't be searched and seized, someone says, well, because you're in a public parking lot, then it's okay for me to put a GPS tracker under your car. And because you were stupid enough to buy an iPhone, then you have ipso facto pre-authorized surveillance to Apple, so it's okay, right? And as I was commenting to my friend Ron, when somebody floated that idea that people are doing stuff with Google, that then it should be okay with the government. I mean, my girlfriend does certain things to me when we're having sex that I wouldn't want most of you to do to me just because I let her do them to me. So let's zoom back a little bit and talk about constitutional law and the Bill of Rights. The Constitution famously says nothing about right of privacy. The people who are advocating the state's authority to access your information, again, note the words I'm using, your information, right? The people who are advocating that the state has the right to your information frequently will say, well, it doesn't say anything about the rights of privacy. It's kind of like, when your kid says, can I have a cookie, Mommy? And then you say, no, you can't. And then they go, okay, fine. Can I have something else? You say, I can have a carrot. And then they go eat a carrot cake. It's the same kind of thing. It's like we say no to these people over and over again. The Constitution, the Bill of Rights, they say no, no, no to state authority. And they keep coming up with clever, weaselly ways of parsing it and stretching that Overton window. So the Bill of Rights amendments have three places that deal with this notion of privacy, right? There's the privacy of the person and possessions against unreasonable search. There's the privilege against self-incrimination, which is absolutely critical to this, by the way, right? If you've got a GPS transmitter under my receiver and recorder under my car, and you're tracking where I'm going, I am incriminating myself. Right? So there's some questions there. And then there's this other notion about enumeration of other rights not construed to deny or disparage, which is the ninth, okay? It's the fourth that's been the center of the privacy debate, and that's around this notion of unreasonable search, right? The idea of we're not going to go into somebody's place. But the part that everybody else keeps forgetting about, especially amazingly in this discussion that we're having about FISA courts and warrants, nobody talks about these words. No warrants shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. What about this is unclear? Can anyone here in the room raise their hand and say, I totally don't understand this? Okay, I didn't think so. It's pretty clear that the idea of driftnet search and seizure is not on the table. Somehow it's gotten on the table, and that's an interesting point. Warrants, particularly describing the place to be seized and the persons or things to be seized, right? So someone can get a warrant and say, I'm going to your house, the judge will issue a warrant saying you're going to seize Marcus's diary, and then the judge can, the police can go to my mom and say, here's a warrant to seize Marcus's diary, hand it over, and mom will hand it over. Mom would hand it over if they just asked nicely anyway. But that's beside the point, right? The idea is that you have to describe the thing that's being seized. And the reason for this, philosophically, is very straightforward. You can't have probable cause to think something's gone wrong if you don't know what the cause is. Let's see, I have probable cause to think that maybe if I knew everything about you, I might know that you were doing something wrong. Think about that one for a second, right? It's this catch-22, double bind type scenario. How can the state possibly suspect you for doing something without knowing what they suspect you did? But that's the idea of driftnet searches, right? So when we've dragged that Overton window to the point where the government is doing these driftnet searches, what we're really talking about is a complete violation of the social contract on which the United States was founded. I mean, I don't want to put it in too big a way, but it's pretty obvious, right? If you're collecting it and it's leading you to be suspicious, it can't possibly be just metadata. Right? If you look at my phone call records and you go, wow, Marcus called a known methamphetamine dealer. By the way, I don't do that. That's not a real example. But if you look at my phone records and you see that I called a known methamphetamine dealer, then here's the problem. You knew it was a methamphetamine dealer that I was calling. It's not just metadata. It's now probable cause because you searched and see something that you knew was going to give you information about what private things I was doing. This is fairly straightforward. Okay, let's keep moving from that. The NSA is also conspired to rewrite the notion of what surveillance means. And one of the things that Snowden did teach us is that the NSA has decided that it's not surveillance if there's no actual human eyeballs involved. Tell this to Google. Google doesn't do search. Google doesn't do search because if Google doesn't do search, there's no human eyeballs involved, they're not actually doing search, right? Google only does search at the point where your eyeballs read the stuff that comes up on the screen. At least that would be the prevailing view that we would get out of Washington. So a robotic scoring system, which is, I don't have another word for it than looking, right? But search involves the idea of looking. So it's impossible to flag something as more interesting without actually searching for them. If you think about this, this is another completely bizarre catch-22 that doesn't line up. Now, again, I'm not trying to say whether these things are right or wrong or whether the government should or shouldn't be doing them, but the very words that the government is using to describe these things are implicit lies. And you might want to consider that when you go forward, okay? And again, the very actions that the government is taking in order to reinterpret some extremely clear laws indicates not that they're trying to reinterpret the laws in order to clarify them, they are reinterpreting the laws in order to bypass them. And again, whether or not you think that's appropriate is up to you. I'll offer some suggestions for that in a few minutes. But we need to be honest with ourselves about what's actually going on, right? There is a lot of lying. All right. And again, metadata, it's a conundrum. Here's the problem. If it's worth collecting, then it's actually not worthless information, right? If it's worth collecting who Marcus calls to and from, then it should actually be private. Because if it wasn't worth anything, you wouldn't want it. Right? It's the same screwed up logic thrown straight back at the government advocates that they're saying, if it's not worth anything, then why did you want to steal it? Right? Why did you want it? Well, obviously it's worth something, right? So it's very difficult to frame a warrant for bulk data collection that's within the scope of the fourth wording. Although the only way I can come up with it is if you've got the requirements for a warrant to describe the location of the thing that is being accessed. I think what that is being interpreted as by the FBI now is it's on that hard drive. That's the location. Give me that hard drive. Right? Well, they know where it is, right? It's on the hard drive. The problem, of course, is that all of this fundamentally pretends to not understand what information is and pretends to not understand how we expect our information to be treated. These are lies. The short form of that is lies. So if you want to think about this in 1776 terms, metadata would be tracking everybody who goes up and down certain turnpikes and just keeping that information, George Washington went through here. You keep all that stuff. And then you put it together and you go, obviously there's a conspiracy. All these characters got together at this particular day. This is kind of interesting. Gee, I wish we had a Predator drone so we could blow their asses up. And you can correlate this sort of stuff. And again, if it's worth collecting to correlate, it must be worth protecting, because otherwise, why would you want it? Then it wouldn't be worth anything. So by now you're probably thinking I'm a crazy lefty bleeding heart liberal, which is totally okay. I'm not actually that I'm kind of all over the place, as you'll see. And so I wanted to go back and look at the history of the evolution of ideas of privacy in post Enlightenment republics. And there's some things we need to think about. Some context. The founding fathers, who many Americans revere, I don't, by the way, who wrote the Constitution, they were very concerned with privacy and search. Why? They were mostly criminals and oligarchs. Right? John Hancock was a smuggler who was smuggling rum and slaves in violation of a bunch of different British laws. The British were putting various laws on the people who later became the American founding fathers in order to try to tax them, because they were all tax cheats. These guys were all land speculators who were hiding their profits. George Washington picked up huge tracts of land from Indian tribes that conveniently got wiped out in the process. These were not nice people. These were people who, especially if you were King George, were criminals. They were unsavory sorts who managed to whip up the people into a rebellion over taxation, which is kind of interesting. But they were concerned with search and seizure, right? Jefferson was selling tobacco, he owned slaves, he was selling cotton. There's big questions as to whether or not Jefferson basically paid any taxes on any of this stuff at all. So of course our founding fathers were deeply concerned with privacy. They're the typical concerns of the wealthy and powerful. And those concerns are, I stole a whole bunch of stuff and I want to keep it. And if people realize how badly I've gotten over on them, they may give me a tumble ride, or it might be peasants with pitchforks and torches. Right? We want to be concerned about that. So now let's delve a little bit into the history of privacy. It's difficult to get some of this out. Privacy in the Roman era was not really a big deal. If you were the paterfamilias in the Roman Empire, you'd have a great big party, you'd do whatever you want. If somebody came along and said, your party bothers me, they'd go, screw you. Privacy was not really that big of a deal, because naked power was really the way things were done. Privacy has historically only been the purview of the wealthy and powerful, and the basic people can just kind of lump it, right? So through most of the Dark Ages, following the fall of Rome, by the way, privacy in Greek society was pretty much similar to Rome. Right? Although the Greeks, bless their hearts, were fairly honest about things, right? So you read Plato and you see accounts that basically the Platonic accounts of many of the symposia was Socrates and a bunch of his guys getting really pissed on booze and dancing girls and arguing political philosophy, right? The Greeks were fairly open about this kind of stuff, which was fairly nice. It wasn't really until the invention of shame in the Christian era that people began to be a little bit concerned about the difference between your public persona and your private persona. The ancients, up until the fall of Rome, the distance between your public and private persona were pretty much zero, right? It wasn't until really Christianity took things over in the Dark Ages that we had this notion of the sins that were taking place in public, and then we had guys like Alexander VI having these humongous orgies essentially in the Papal See, and then coming out and preaching people about not doing sin. So peasants and vassals didn't need privacy at all. They didn't have privacy. They were in fact treated as property by all of the feudal landlords. And they didn't have anything to hide. The only thing that a peasant could hide is that maybe they had a particularly good bunch of potatoes. Please don't do it. Potatoes they were from the New World. But I had a particularly good wine crop this year. Please don't take all of it. Right? That was the kind of thing that they did. The wealthy had to conceal their wealth. The wealthy had to conceal their wealth from each other or from monarchs. Right? So if you were the duke of someplace and all of your peasants had a particularly good wine crop on your behalf, you didn't want the king to know that, because he'd come along and ask for a chunk of your wine slice. This is basically the mafia, right? So if you're skimming off the big guy's going to send armed dudes to come sort you out. It sounds like The Sopranos. It's because it's exactly the same business model as The Sopranos. And for exactly the same reason, you had the different people keeping secrets from each other. The monarchs kept secrets from their nobles. The nobles kept secret from their monarchs. The nobles kept secrets from each other. And the peasants had no secrets because they were just happy if they didn't starve or get trampled by guys in armor. Okay. So that's a little bit about the history of privacy, a little bit more. The powerful need to conceal this stuff because basically the only way you can play the Game of Thrones is to have privacy. right? If you imagine for a second Game of Thrones, any of you who've been watching that show, I think it's kind of fun. I watched the first couple seasons, so don't give me any spoilers. But imagine how pointless the Game of Thrones would be if everything was done in the open, right? And here's the point. The only person in the Game of Thrones who would be able to do everything on the open is the one person who really doesn't care. Right back to Roman times. Caesar did what Caesar did because he was Caesar. And if you complained, he had a solution for you. He didn't have to hide what he was doing. Everybody else had to hide what they were doing because Caesar would find out what they were doing and he had a solution for them, right? So all the flat-out misbehavior had to happen behind closed doors, just as it did when the founding fathers of the United States were misbehaving behind closed doors, right? Now, let's talk about government philosophy and some political philosophy surrounding that. Voltaire. So one of the problems with quoting Voltaire is unless you're using one of his most common quotes, then you forget where it came from. And this is a guy who wrote literally thousands of books and pamphlets, just huge amounts of material. And so I read this when I was a kid, and I thought it was really awesome, and I can't for the life of me remember where. But he once said that once government begins to engage in secret diplomacy, it cannot last for long. And what he really meant is this fascinating problem that you have with government that begins to engage in secret diplomacy, in which the left hand keeps secrets from the right hand. It's that simple. The NSA keeps secrets from the CIA. I don't know if you heard me banging my head flat on the table when they were talking about the intelligence failures that led up to 9/11. But I mean, there was an FBI agent who was going to his bosses and saying, we got this problem. We got these guys who want to learn how to fly airplanes, but they don't want to learn how to take off or land. Something's kind of weird here. And those organizations were so dysfunctional that they couldn't actually act on that information. You don't need to driftnet every one of the country's communications when you have an intelligence nugget like that dropped in your lap and you go, ugh, and you wipe it off onto the floor. Okay, so one of the things that's going on when these people are talking about these kinds of intelligence disasters is they're trying to conceal how incredibly incompetent they were. And in return, they're saying, we really, really, really sucked, but if you give us, thank you. We really, really, really screwed the pooch, but if you give us more money, we swear we won't screw the pooch so hard again. What? Right? If you take money and you give it to a dysfunctional bureaucracy, you will not get solutions. You will get a bigger dysfunctional bureaucracy. It will just turn into the Godzilla of dysfunctional bureaucracies, and we now have that. It's called the Department of Homeland Security. I'm sorry, but, right? All of that drift netting that they've been doing on all of the communications, and they didn't catch the Boston bombers, right? You all gave up all your privacy so that they could still not catch the Boston bombers. Okay, I'm not saying the Boston bombers did a good thing. It was a horrible thing. But if you're all being asked to give up your privacy rights in order to ostensibly prevent the next 9/11, we should see some prevention happening. But if you actually look at what's happening, most of the terrorist attacks that are being stopped were instigated by the FBI and subsequently caught by the FBI. It's a pretty good way of doing it. Okay, so now let's talk about democracy and some political philosophy. Democracy is a political system in which the people comprise the government. The way that people think, probably the best way to think about this is that the government is an emergent property of the people. The government is the distillation of the will of the people. And we need some mechanisms in place in order to distill the will of the people so that the government kind of goes in the correct direction. But what you really want to think of is democracy is sort of the ultimate fish schooling algorithm. If we're all kind of going that way, the whole school is going to kind of go that way, right? If it doesn't work, we split off and we go separate directions. Now we're two schools. That's the way it works. So the government is enacting the will of the people. This is one of the reasons why I won't go into that. But if the government ceases to obey the people, it's no longer a democracy. It cannot be called a democracy, right? The idea of a democracy is that you're following the will of the people. Otherwise, it's something else. So you have to do that, right? So here's another consequence that comes out of that. If the idea of a democracy is that you're following the will of the people cannot spy on themselves. I cannot agree meaningfully to have my own government do something in secret from me to me. What am I going to do? Write a blank check saying, by the way, as part of being a citizen of this country, you're welcome to do whatever you want to me? No one would agree to that, right? But that's what the folks in Washington seem to think that you've all agreed to. So think about that one. How do you give yourself permission to spy on yourself? How do you keep a secret from yourself? How do you negotiate in secret about yourself without yourself knowing about it? These are really interesting problems. Another consequence is that the government cannot keep secrets from the people. Voltaire was right. How can I keep a secret from the people who are supposed to be approving me doing that thing? Right? And this is the problem with the entire idea of a Senate Intelligence Oversight Committee. I cannot authorize Feinstein to listen to stuff about intelligence and make decisions on my behalf, because I don't know what decisions Feinstein is going to have to make on my behalf, because that's secret. That breaks. Because I don't know about you, but wouldn't you like to be in those briefings? Of course you would. I'm fascinated by the idea. I would be perfectly happy to take time off of my busy schedule and drive down to Washington and be briefed on that stuff. As a citizen of the United States, I have absolutely every right to be a participant in that. I'll even promise not to tell anyone unless you're breaking the law. And if I have clear and incontrovertible evidence that you're breaking the law, I might try to show up with some cops, and then things would get ugly. The cops wouldn't listen to me anyway, blah, blah, blah. But a government that's acting on behalf of the people cannot possibly hide those actions from the people. It cannot, and the reason is because of consent. I cannot consent to an unknown, not meaningfully, right? And there's huge amounts of law surrounding this, although I'm sure the folks in Washington are going to be going, ooh, how do we change that, right? There's this notion of informed consent. You can't sign a contract with someone to do something to you that you don't understand. Well, by definition, if it's secret, I can't agree to it because I don't understand it. By the way, I think if most of us understood what Senator Feinstein was agreeing to on our behalves, we'd be going, wait a minute, you what? Right? And then the second question, which is always the two-coquet question, which is, do you think Senator Feinstein would agree to those things if Feinstein was subject to them the same way? And we see that Feinstein complained like crazy when the CIA apparently was accessing her systems, right? Well, I complain like crazy if they were accessing my systems too. Sauce for the goose. Sauce for the goose. Okay? So in a representative democracy, you can argue that there's a delegation of oversight, but as I just explained, that doesn't work either, because the government can't keep secrets from me and have that person still represent me effectively. They're no longer representing me, they're acting as an independent actor, and now I have the problem of how do I trust them? Now, obviously, if Feinstein was saying, these are the decisions that I made on your behalf, do you still want to vote for me? Then I could still vote for them or not, right? So, okay. So this is the unfair version. If they're not doing anything wrong, why are they hiding it? If the people in Washington aren't doing things wrong, why are they bending over backwards to keep secrets? If the NSA wasn't doing anything wrong, they'd publish all the stuff about all these programs about what they're capturing. They'd tell us what metadata they're collecting. They'd tell us who they're collecting metadata on, right? Sauce for the goose. The same argument, which is a bad argument, by the way, but it works just as well pointing the other direction. So let's think about that. Maybe we've got it backwards. Here's where I'd like to go. Maybe we shouldn't allow anyone in the government to have any privacy at all. If you run for elected office, you're a servant of the people, you will be surveilled 24/7. The problem is we've understood that these people will make negotiations in secret, they'll take money under the table, they'll do all kinds of stuff, and by the way, they're the most dangerous people in the United States. Talk about probable cause. Anyone who wants to run for office, I have probable cause to believe that they're a liar and a thief. We understand that they have constituents that they serve. We understand that money in politics is a big deal. We, the people, should be able to watch these people with a much higher degree of surveillance than a normal person, because we're giving them more responsibility. We expect more from them. I want to see everything. I'm even willing to watch them go to the bathroom. I don't care. But let's crowdsource this stuff, put it up on the internet, and watch every single waking and sleeping moment of these people's lives. It's only fair. Right? It's the same argument that they're making against us. Now, the other piece is we shouldn't allow business leaders to have privacy either. At all. Anybody who makes more than a certain amount of money should have no right to privacy. Why? That's a kind of absurd idea, isn't it? Right? But here's why. We've seen that somebody who's a big-time executive, like the guys who are running Enron, can do disproportionate damage to society. Enron, I hate to say this, Enron probably did more damage to America than September 11th, right? Well, we should watch those guys. If you're an executive, you should be under 24/7 surveillance. If you're rich, look at the Koch brothers. Look at Sheldon Adelson. We should be watching every second what these people do. Why? Because they're playing politics. Not only are they using their disproportionate wealth, they're now beginning to use it for political influence. So they absolutely have given up any right to have privacy against we the people. And of course, all the people who work for the intelligence community, of course they should be carrying geolocation so we can tell where they are, so we can tell where the CIA is. So, I mean, I don't know about you. How many of you guys authorized, woke up one morning and went, I really think that the CIA should overthrow the government in Libya today? How many of you thought that? Well, if you didn't wake up, okay, a couple of you, okay, so we've got some imperialists in the room. Good. Put your big hats on and own it. But, you know, the point is that unless we actually did collectively say, I think we should overthrow the government in Libya today, then democracy was stolen in that moment. So the obvious conclusion is that we're not a democracy. I hate to break it to you. Don't want to raise your blood cynicism levels unduly, but that's the only thing that could kind of come out. So I've got a couple final thoughts and then I'll shut up and crawl away. After years of thinking about philosophy, I finally have only come up with one contribution to moral philosophy, which is kind of based on some stuff that Epicurus said, but it goes like this. Power has no value unless it's abused. There's absolutely no point to having power unless you plan to abuse it. There's a difference between leadership and power. Leadership is when you can step forward and say, the building's on fire, I know the exit's over here, please follow. That power, that evaporates as soon as the problem is solved. But actually trying to have and maintain power over others, why would you want it? The only reason you'd want it is so that you can steal their crap later or steal their daughters or something, you know, sneak on them, right? So that's why we want that. So the corollary is wealth is a portable form of power, so the wealthy should also not be exempt from this. And of course, people who desire power are, by definition, your enemy. So we need to acknowledge the fact that the people feel the desire to have some of their actions secret. And this is okay. I think one of the things that we should do as a human species is acknowledge the fact that I really don't want you to see me walking around in my underwear at home. And that's just because I don't really like the way I look in my underwear. But I can get over that. I can wrap my brain around that. And we can start to talk about what sorts of things do we not want people to be able to see each other doing. And that could be financial transactions or buying congressmen. So let's acknowledge that the government has no right for privacy. And the government workers, as agents of the people, cannot ever claim to be off duty. If you're an agent of the people, if you're acting on my behalf, I'm sorry, but I own you 24/7. You work for me. You have no rights from me. You cannot keep a secret from me. You should not be able to keep a secret from me. I'm guessing they're probably not going to like this theory. Let's acknowledge that the wealthy have disproportionate influence on government due to the way that money's employed, and let's say they don't have any right to privacy either. In fact, none of us have any right to privacy. I'm okay with that. Let's kill privacy, but let's kill it evenly. Okay, so I'm pretty much done. The only point that I want to conclude with is this. We are now in the position that the nuclearists were in the 1950s, where they built this thing and then some of them had regrets. And they said, wait a minute, we built this thing and it's really actually kind of horrible, right? There are people who built information systems that are the ones that are sucking up all of your phone calls and violating all of your privacy. There are people who are penetrating those databases on behalf of us, the government, for those of us who are the governed, right? We are building these kinds of systems. And so one of the questions we have to ask is whether to go along with it or not. And one of the ways, honestly, is to look at that gigantic Homeland Security gravy train and maybe say, I could just do an honest job instead. I don't really have to work on things that are against my own interest. Because ultimately, if you look at what's been happening with the National Security Agency and with the Snowden disclosures, we see a tremendous amount of skilled computer professionals who are working against their own interests. And that's really the thing I'd like to get you to think about today. Ask yourself, whenever you approach any of this stuff, is this for me? Or is this for something else? And if the answer is, it's not for me, and it's not for my friends, and it's not for my family, it's for something else, just don't do it. Just say no. Play World of Warcraft instead. You've got plenty of stuff you can do on that particular day. So I think I should run away now.
Oh, I don't know that the crowd's going to let you off, but a big round of applause for Marcus. What a compelling view. So I don't know, Richard ran his panel over a little bit, so I think it's only right that we that we have to at least have like 2 or 3 questions after that
Sure.
that talk. I mean, is that you, Sasha, coming up for a question? Oh, no. Crap, I promised Dr. Stahl that no one would have to hear from you.
That's fine. Let's go.
Of course, I have to ask you a question, Marcus. It was great. But fundamentally, when you talk about the people, we the people, as if it's one humongous us, but we're not. We're all bunches of us, and some of us want to collect information about others of us. And it seems to me that, part of what you've got to address is that question as well. You begin to us versus the billionaires, but it's not just us versus the billionaires. It's pick your poison in that case. I mean, you look at what goes on in some jurisdictions, particularly people of color. They're the ones who are surveillance is happening to. Others, it's persons of a particular political perspective, and so on. I think part of the dialogue has got to be around that issue as well. So
I would argue taking a position of radical inaction in the face of anything that's not harmful, right? So for someone to argue for me to take a specific action, they should be arguing why not taking that action is going to be harmful. And this is where the whole notion of probable cause and stuff like that comes in. So if somebody is going to tell me we need to be surveying everything that the Iraqi citizens are talking about, I would like to hear an argument how an Iraqi citizen in Iraq is threatening my farm in north central Pennsylvania. And if the answer is you can't come up with a plausible thing that's going to scare me enough to authorize that activity, then no, you shouldn't do it. That's really the problem. What we basically moved into is an environment in which proactive motion, even if it's probably wrong, is being favored over inertia, and I'm a big fan of inertia. Yes, I'm a Taoist.
That's a good answer.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Big round of applause. Oh, do we have another question?
I don't think so.
They can't wait for Richard to get up?
There's one.
Come to the mic, Jim.
Yeah, I'm a 2-year-old, and what you have been saying I can relate to very much. But what I don't get very clear is, what is your mission right now? What is your real message as we go forward with internet, with surveillance, with all the technology that we have available now, and it's going to get worse every single day, worse or whatever. But what? Because you have a certain amount of passion at the moment. You've got a tremendous amount of experience, got a tremendous amount of background, and all that. But what's your overall mission right now going forward? What's your major message?
Well, I think we've lost control of the machinery of government in the United States, and I think it's too late. Actually, I don't think we ever really had control of it. So I think that it's too late. The question is it going to get worse or is it going to get better? I don't think it's going to get better. I don't think it's actually particularly possible for it to get better. But in that situation, the only answer I can give is similar to the way I feel about global warming. Okay, I can make the problem worse. I know I can make the problem worse. I can make the problem a little bit better for myself. I can burn fewer fossil fuels. I can't stop someone else from doing that. I can't make the world a better place. I can make my world a better place. I can make my actions more cautious. I can make my actions more responsible. If everyone makes their actions more cautious and more responsible, then maybe we actually can turn the battleship. And that is a problem. I mean, one of the most important works that I ever read as a child was Etienne de Boétie's treatise on human subjection. And he asks this question, which is wonderful, which is, all around the world, I see people following horrible, foolish leaders into stupid, wasteful wars. Why don't people just go, this is dumb, and stay home? I still ask that question. We look at the things that are happening around us, and a lot of these things, especially involving this computer security surveillance state, what we should be doing is saying, this is dumb. Stop doing this. I mean, honestly, instead of spending the money on building this gigantic NSA surveillance center in Utah that can monitor everything what I do, I favor single-payer health care. The government could do that. Cancel the frickin' F-35 Joint Strike Fighter and do something useful with the money. Yes, I'm a peacenik. I grew up in the 60s, and I remember people coming back from Vietnam broken and bleeding. And all my entire life, I have seen nothing but streams of people coming home broken and bleeding from dumb imperial wars that the United States starts. It's not Saddam Hussein who starts these wars. In case anyone missed that particular piece of information, we went and attacked him. It's not the North Koreans that are trying. I almost lost my shit when the guy was saying that North Korea is threatening us. If North Korea had 5 nuclear weapons and delivery vehicles, what would they do against our 12,000? Right? They wouldn't do anything. Kim Il-sung even said to an American congressman when he was visiting the United Nations back in the 70s, he said, what would we do if we had nuclear weapons? We would guarantee the death of North Korea. They're not going to attack us. There aren't that many people who are that stupid outside of Washington.
So we have stirred up great controversy. I see there's a few folks. Let's take one more question so we can get to our platinum sponsor. And Richard will buy those other people who came in line more drinks. See Richard for extra drink tickets.
Okay, so it seems like the panel, your comments, a lot of this is all based in a system where ownership of an individual's data is still a debate. So,
I don't think it is. Go on.
So the big question is, I mean, do you think it's an issue of ownership? And I own my own data. I mean, if you ask Google, their lawyers are going to say, well, as soon as you put it on their server, it's theirs.
Yeah. Again, these are interpretations that have to happen to laws. And if we actually believe, it comes back again to this doctrine of informed consent. If we actually believe that people were meaningfully reading part of their usage agreement from Google, where it said, we may give your data to anyone who asks for it nicely, or we may be such poor custodians of that data. Well, that was another thing that amazed me. One of the things Snowden disclosed was that the federal government was stealing data from Google from inside their encrypted window. Right? Google did not authorize this. They completely bypassed that authorization process. So that's one place where we can't even say that there's an informed consent there. But if anyone here wants to, as part of informed consent, say, I give you my data, you have full rights over it, you can do whatever you want, that's fine, more power to you. You can do that under informed consent. But I do argue that the very fact that people put private stuff in their email means that they think their email is private. It's that simple. I wouldn't carry on an extramarital affair via my Gmail account. By the way, I'm not married, I'm just using it as an example. But I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't do dope deals via Gmail if I didn't think it was private. And so the whole thing is kind of hung by its own logic, right? Yes, it absolutely should be private. There is a question, and I think that as part of those terms of service, if I could informed manner consent that Google says we may periodically look through there, and if we see that you're making and selling crystal meth, we're going to send you to advertisers that are selling crystal meth making stuff. Okay. If I can be informed of that and consent to it, then I'm a fool, and that's okay. But really, the issue about this whole discussion, and I think the reason why I'm kind of holding down this really weird anchoring position on the far left, is that the dialogue has gotten down to how hard you're going to get raped. But there's no question that you're getting raped. In fact, you're already being raped right now. They're just arguing about how many people are going to do it and how thoroughly and whether you're going to survive afterwards. And I'm the weirdo over here going, maybe we could discuss this whole rape thing. It's just not a great idea. And I don't recall that giving consent to even starting rape. And that's really what's going on. Now, I'm not trying to trivialize rape. It's actually much more severe than having your data stolen. Okay, I couldn't come up with a better example off the top of my head. But that's what's going on. And this is very, very deliberate. This is the same thing that's been happening, and then I will shut up, I promise. This is the same thing that's been happening in Washington regarding militarism. There's this notion of, collateral damage and stuff like this. These are ways that Overton window gets stretched further and further towards the political extreme at one end of the spectrum, whereas most of us understand that, collateral damage means people die. And I don't favor any of it. But so they come up with these nice words that sound okay, and then they come up with justifications for why it's necessary. That's bullshit. We need to just kind of stand back and go, what exactly did you just tell me you were doing for my own good? And why didn't you do me the courtesy of asking me if I approve of it? Don't say Senator Feinstein approved of it for me. Ask me if I approve of it. I've got the time and the attention. Send me an email. I'll reply.
Marcus, thank you for compelling us at the end of our day. On behalf of the Los Angeles ISSA, we've made a donation in your name to the ISSA.